As the freshly sworn-in 113th session of Congress gets underway in Washington, D.C., all eyes, both here in the United States and around the world, are waiting and watching to see whether or not there exists in the United States a patriotic core of leadership that can first put an out-of-control Obama administration in check, and second, who will call the bluff on the increasingly difficult-to-hide bankrupt transatlantic financial system, using the power of the U.S. federal government to exert its sovereignty above and beyond international finance, and put this cartel of banks and their sidekicks in their place.
Thanks to the votes of Democrats and Republicans in Congress,
the game is up, and both Democrats and Republicans alike are realizing that the fiscal cliff and the debt ceiling so-called debates have been largely a charade to distract from the truth of the matter, which is that after over 4 years of hyperinflationary bailouts, combined with the first phases of the implementation of reforms proposed in response to the 2007 and 2008 crises, the United States and the planet are now in a more dangerous situation than we were 5 years ago.
In his first-ever news conference, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke...
In other words, the way the 2007-2008 financial crisis has been handled first by the Bush administration and for the last 4 years by the Obama administration has been working directly against the interests of the United States and has instead served only to temporarily keep the doors of a few of the world's largest banks open at the expense of the sovereignty of the nations who have heretofore agreed to bail them out. In an article by Matt Taibbi titled Secrets and Lies of the Bailout, Taibbi writes that the bailouts have been one of the biggest and most elaborate falsehoods ever sold to the American people. We were told that the taxpayer was stepping in, only temporarily, mind you, to prop up the economy and save the world from financial catastrophe. What we actually ended up doing was the exact opposite, committing American taxpayers to permanent, blind support of an ungovernable, unregulatable, hyper-concentrated new financial system that exacerbates the greed and inequality that caused the crash and forces Wall Street banks like Goldman Sachs and Citigroup to increase their risk rather than reduce it. And just as the bailouts have been a fraud, so too are the so-called reforms that are now beginning to be implemented here in the United States and in Europe. Just 2 months ago, LPAC organizers, in discussions on Capitol Hill regarding the immediate restoration of Glass-Steagall banking separation, were told by many offices, let's give the Dodd-Frank reform some time to work. However, already in the first week of the 113th Congress, it is widely understood that these so-called banking reforms have been a time-wasting catastrophe. After all, it's hard to take seriously proposed banking reform from the same administration and Treasury Department who have, in just the last year, let the greatest interest rate rigging scheme to date go unpunished, and also agreed to a $2 billion settlement with the leading drug money laundering and terrorist financing institution on the planet. Something about this administration's record tells me that they're not necessarily interested in reform. So, if there's not an ally in the White House for the kind of emergency banking reorganization that is going to rescue the U.S. economy, where must that leadership come from? The U.S. Congress. Throughout the last 5 years, the U.S. Congress has continued to cede authority to big-shot names in economics like Paul Volcker, Warren Buffett, Tim Geithner, and even Jamie Dimon. How many more bank failures and transatlantic scandals do there have to be for the Congress to realize that the only thing these so-called experts are actually good at is getting the transatlantic governments to bail them out? In fact, this is exactly what IMF chief economist Olivier Blanchard just admitted to publicly last week. In a rare admission that their own policy of imposed austerity has been a deadly failure, particularly in the case of Greece, whose economy has been gutted by international authorities' insistence that the government reduce their deficit, Blanchard said, forecasters significantly underestimated the increase in unemployment and the decline in domestic demand associated with fiscal consolidation.
An estimated 30,000 people marched through Athens Thursday in a second wave of protests against civil service pay cuts and a freeze on pensions worth $6.5
The timing of Blanchard's statement comes just weeks before similar cuts are scheduled for the United States economy, in what the Obama administration has deceptively called a fiscal cliff or debt ceiling debate. In an article published late last year by Paul Craig Roberts titled "The Fiscal Cliff is a Diversion, the Derivative Tsunami and the Dollar Bubble," Roberts warned then that the fiscal cliff is automatic spending cuts and tax increases in order to reduce the deficit by an insignificant amount over 10 years if Congress takes no action itself to cut spending and raise taxes. In other words, the fiscal cliff is going to happen either way. Regardless, the fiscal cliff is about small numbers compared to the derivative tsunami or the bond market and dollar market bubbles. The bond and dollar market bubbles that Roberts is referring to is what the Fed, under Obama, has proposed with their QE4 policy of creating an $85 billion a month bailout loop between the Fed, the Treasury, and the top 18 banks. A deal whose only legitimacy comes from the fact that the federal government is agreeing to honor the toxic assets the top banks are holding on to. However, as the austerity measures imposed on Greece and other European nations is demonstrating, without a national economy whose wealth generation you can claim as your bailout fund, the game is over, which is why the austerity measures throughout Europe are beginning to backfire, and will backfire here in the United States in the weeks and months ahead unless leaders of the U.S. Congress wholly cancel Obama's austerity agenda and move for a Glass-Steagall reorganization and a physical economic recapitalization of the U.S. economy. Now, what the IMF chief economist Blanchard did not admit, and what the U.S. Congress cannot afford to learn in hindsight, is that the unchecked policy of reckless money printing by the U.S. and Europe has begun to create serious tensions among our leading partners internationally. On January 7th, in China's People's Daily Online, a leading unsigned article titled "U.S. and EU Printing Money Furiously to Shift Debt Burden" warns that the United States and European Union policy of quantitative easing has increased the imported inflationary pressure facing China and has reduced the value of its huge foreign exchange reserves. Printing excessive amounts of the U.S. dollar and euro, two international reserve currencies, are bound to exert negative effects on other countries. The money printed by the United States and European Union may pour into emerging economies, hit their financial systems, cause exchange rate fluctuations, and increase the risk of financial regulation. The article continues, Vice Minister of Finance Li Yong said that the depreciation of the U.S. dollar and euro has made it more difficult for China to manage its foreign exchange reserves and already caused heavy losses to the reserves. It should be understood that this statement is not merely an observation from our number one creditor. The timing of these remarks intersects the transition of new leadership in China, and that this warning was published as one of the first utterances from that government is significant. What the Chinese recognize, as do many other nations, is that the money printing policy and its implications are not internal politics of the United States or even the transatlantic. If Glass-Steagall is not rammed through the Congress and a recapitalization of the U.S. dollar jump-started on an emergency basis in the beginning weeks of the 113th Congress, the implications of the hyperinflation of the U.S. dollar across the planet is tantamount in effect to warfare. In fact, many of the leading non-NATO nations have viewed the U.S. ABM deployments in Europe and the Asia pivot policy as compensation for the West's deteriorating global financial power. So the time is short for the 113th Congress to push back against the Obama administration's willfully destructive fiscal austerity agenda. The momentum is there both inside and outside the United States for a Glass-Steagall bankruptcy reorganization and for the Congress to reassert its power of the purse. And for those out there who want to scream big government at the thought of trillion-dollar federal infrastructure projects like NWAPA 21, let's be honest, the federal government, when it wants to, has a little better investment record than Wall Street at this point.